Gospel is written in the 5th chapter of St. Mark, beginning at the 21st verse. When Jesus had crossed again into the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body, and she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. And then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went into where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was about 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. When I was meeting with a sermon group this week, they asked me what I was going to speak on this Sunday. And I said what I'm going to speak on, the basic theme for this Sunday, is dealing with the similarities in basic principles of a representative democracy and the church, the Christian church. I got kind of a scared look on their face. There's a separation of church and state. Are you going to get involved in politics? Well, I'm really not going to get involved in politics, but I am going to say some things about democracy or a representative democracy and its basic principles, if they are kept, and how they are similar with the basic Christian principles, if they are kept. I think, first of all, we need one Sunday a year where we thank God for the country that we live in. This is why I am so faithful to our God and Country program, because I believe in this country. Now, I'm not turning my eyes to all the problems that we have, the conflicts that we have within, and the principles that we haven't observed as a country, even as I support the church when it hasn't necessarily lived up to the principles that it has set for itself. We are indeed fortunate to be Christian. We are indeed fortunate to live in this country. Because our country, it's far easier to live as a Christian in this country than any other kind of government. It's better than a dictatorship. Oh yes, there are dictators that are faithful to caring for people, but that varies. One disappears and another one comes, and it becomes very difficult to live in that kind of a country. It is better than living in an oligarchy where there is a ruling class. It all depends what the ruling class is really in favor of, to whether you are treated as a human being or not. We really don't live in a democracy either. You realize that. For a democracy, all those decisions about our activities are made on an individual scale. We have representatives that we vote in, and they are restrained by certain rules of a constitution. And that makes it a republic, not really a democracy. Or if we wanted to call it a democracy, then it is a limited or a representative democracy. But our government is committed to free exercise of religion, the Bill of Rights, the freedom of minorities, right to dissent, and separation of church and state. And again, they don't always live up to these principles, but they are the ones that guide us, and we always keep them in mind in trying to be a good Christian and a good citizen. Well, what are these similarities that we have in common, a church with a country? And I'm not equating Christianity with a democracy, because if we do that, we misrepresent both the democracy and Christianity. The first thing we have in common is that both of us place an emphasis on the individual. In our gospel text, we see a perfect example of that. The many stories of Jesus in the New Testament concentrate on his involvement with individuals. Yes, he spoke to the crowds. Yes, he performed miracles for the 5,000. But out of the crowds came individuals. And Jesus was always focused on that. In our country, we have tried to focus on individuals. It is not a group thing, other than we are bound together as individuals for common purposes, common ideals. In Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he talks about a country imbibed in a new concept of freedom for the people, by the people, and of the people. Government places emphasis on how it governs. Thomas Jefferson said, "The care of human life and happiness, not their distraction, is the only legitimate object of a good government." Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, God values individuals and includes justice for the orphan, the widow, and loves the stranger. And as we pointed out, Jesus, in many of the stories that we have for our text on Sunday morning, is concentrated on the individual. The second thing that we have in common, both Christianity and representative democracy recognize a loyalty above the state. And you said, oh, really? Well, I pay taxes. I have to be involved in all those things that the government requires, governed by laws. The Declaration of Independence, in its closing statement, makes this statement. And for the support of this Declaration of Independence, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our honors. That's from the Declaration of Independence, talking about a divine providence. So that's another name for God. Again, Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, we pledge that this nation under God will experience a new birth of freedom. The government realizes when the founding fathers got together that government needed a check. So it created three branches: the executive, the judicial, the legislative, so that one can't get out of hand. Because when human beings have power, they have a tendency to corrupt that power. And God always stands above the decisions of mankind. The New Testament tells us to be good citizens, but we are members of a higher world. The government exists for the protection of its people and the defending of its national purpose, which is to protect its people and to provide them a life that's structured and in which they can enjoy a freedom. The New Testament says we are citizens of this country, but we are citizens of a greater country to come. Our real kingdom is in heaven, but we support the honor and the integrity and the well-being of our government on earth. And we call it to account for its deeds, its actions, and its words. The third thing that we have in common is practiced rightly. We not only look out for individuals, but we look out for each other and the quality of each other. The Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal. Now, it took us 3 amendments to the Constitution and the Civil Rights Law to get closer to that statement. But it's what we state. We treat all people equally. That's a very, very prominent theme in the life of Jesus. In our text today, he comes to a person who's head of the synagogue. But he doesn't single out those that are in the synagogue. He comes to those people who aren't even a part of the kingdom of Israel. He talks about Samaritans and paying care for all people. Peter explains in the house of Cornelius that God shows no partiality. Everyone who does right is part of God's kingdom. The fourth thing that we have in common is both the government and church need responsible citizens. What happens to the country when nobody votes? When we don't share or involve ourselves in public office? When we don't vote? When we don't work for the common good? When we try to sleaze out of paying taxes? When we mistreat others? The country suffers and is pained. The same thing that happens to in a church. When we want volunteer, we don't contribute, we don't attend, and we don't love our neighbors. The penalty is exactly the same. Neither the country nor the church is perfect. All of you know this. All of you will swear to this. But nevertheless, we need to take some time in our year, and no better time than the week of the 4th of July, to thank God that we have our country, that we support it, that we have men and women that are willing to die for it, and all citizens who want it to be the best country it can be. We have a flag too, a Christian flag. We explained what it meant. It was thought up in September of 1897 when Charles Overton talked about that the church should have a Christian flag to represent its teachings. And then he talked to a crowd of Brighton Chapel in Long Island, as to what he conceived that flag should be. He met with a group of Methodist young people, missionary movement in 1907, and they together designed this flag. And in January of 1942, it was accepted as the official Christian flag by the Anglicans, the Baptists, the Lutherans, the Mennonites, Presbyterians, the Reformed, the Moravians. This was the Christian flag, and it is now symbolic of we believe. It centers a Christ, a cross in the middle, signifying the bloodshed of Christ for our salvation. It has the white signifying the purity of Christ and the purity that he gives to us through our faith and grace. It has blue to signify the baptismal waters and the constant presence of him in our lives. We have a flag for the United States for which we pledge allegiance. But the real kingdom is the kingdom of God. It is a kingdom that we do not recognize in fullness now, but we will sometimes because he died for us. And we celebrate the Christian flag. Yes, we do need once in a while to talk about government and talk about it positively. We suffer daily with divisions, with people not satisfied, and fighting among ourselves as to what really is the benefit for the whole group. This is not something that should stop. We need discussion. We need differences of opinion. But we need to come together, both as people of a country and people of a church, and join in celebration. Independence for ourselves and everyone else, the gift of God alone. Amen. The sermon hymn is 769, If You But Trust in God to Guide You.